So welcome everybody. This one I'm really looking forward to. We have Stephanie Farrell, Director of the Research Administration at Eisenhower Health. And often during one-on-one consultations with people with Parkinson's and caregivers, I get the same question over and over about clinical trials. People want to know whether there are any trials they can participate in for a potential cure, whether there are new treatments that are not yet available to the public, or even if there are research trials to expand our understanding of Parkinson's in the quest for an eventual cure. It's my great pleasure to welcome Stephanie Farrell, MBA, RN, CCRC, CPHQ. Stephanie, I'll let you let us know what all of those stand for. And Director of Research Administration at Eisenhower Health. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Eileen. I am so happy to be here and to talk to you about research and clinical trials today. Let's see, here's a little bit about me. I have 30 years of healthcare experience. I actually started in the IT world working in computer systems for healthcare, for hospitals and healthcare systems. And I have been doing clinical trials for the last 20 years and am an expert in that. For the last 10 years, I've been a licensed registered nurse. So I got my MBA when I was just young and went back and became a nurse about 14 years ago, started school and have been licensed for the last 10 years. And all those letters after my last name, I'm a certified professional in healthcare quality, and I'm also a certified clinical research coordinator. And for fun, when I'm not pursuing certifications in education, I like to hike in our beautiful Coachella Valley, do a little bit of gentle yoga, and do competitive Wordle with my family. So that's a little bit about me. In the program tonight, I'm going to tell you about how to gather information that you'll need to make treatment decisions if you decide to participate in a clinical trial. I want to talk to you about being an information seeker and questions you can ask your physician and nurses to get more information about clinical trials. I'm going to talk to you about the basics on the different phases of clinical trials and risks and benefits and the protections that are in place for people who participate. We'll go a little bit into the myths and facts about clinical trials and questions you can ask to determine if a trial is right for you, and then a little bit about how to locate both clinical trials and research studies that you might be interested in participating in. Clinical trials are so important. You may not know this, but every single drug and device available today, every device that's used in our hospitals, prescribed by our physicians, every single one of those has gone through the clinical trials process to be deemed safe and effective to be used in patients. And without those clinical trials, we would not make any progress. We wouldn't have new treatments available. And every patient who has volunteered to participate in those clinical trials to test a new medication, to test a new device. They're really cutting a path for you and the future patients to get treatments that may be able to treat disease, cure disease ultimately. So it's just so important that we do clinical trials. Oftentimes these are done at big academic centers, but Eisenhower's made a commitment to doing research and clinical trials locally in the community setting. In addition to those treatments being approved, the way drugs get approved is through clinical trials. Oftentimes, when there's no other treatment available, a clinical trial and the treatment in that trial can be a patient's best option for treatment. There are all different types of clinical research I talked a little bit about treatment trials and the drugs and devices that are studied in treatment trials. There's also prevention research, and this is research that looks at better ways to prevent disorders from developing. Different kinds of prevention research can include looking at lifestyle changes, vaccines, vitamins, minerals. There's diagnostic research that is being done, and that is the practice of looking for better ways to identify a particular disorder or condition in a patient population. And then there's screening research, and this refers to the practice of looking to detect conditions, disorders or health conditions, to then determine how to treat those. Additionally, there are quality of life research studies that are done. And just like it sounds, quality of life studies explore ways to improve the comfort and quality of life for individuals with a particular condition or chronic illness. There are genetic studies that aim to improve the prediction of disorders by identifying and understanding how genes and illnesses may be related. Research in this area can explore ways in which patients' genes make them more or less likely to develop a disorder. And these studies can lead to development of tailor-made treatments based on a patient's genetic makeup. Also, there are epidemiological studies, and those seek to identify the patterns and causes and control of disorders in groups of people. When it comes to clinical trials, and these are really the FDA-regulated clinical trials that are used to test new drugs, test new devices, they're broken down into 4 phases of clinical trials. Phase 1 tests how the drug affects the human body. It includes safety and side effects and appropriate dosage and the best way to give the treatment, whether that's oral or an injection or an infusion. And the phase 1 trials typically include about 20 or more people. Phase 2 trials determine safety and whether the treatment works and how well it works. And phase 2 trials typically include fewer than 100 people, but may include up to 300. Phase 3 trials look at effectiveness, again, safety, side effects, safety in comparison to other treatments. Often in phase 3, you're comparing the new drug with the existing approved drug and seeing which one works better and is safer. Those phase 3 trials can include hundreds of people to thousands of people. Participants in those trials include newly diagnosed or can include those with advanced disease. Patients may or may not receive the investigational treatment under a study that is in a phase 3 randomized trial. The final part of the process in this drug approval is the post-clinical trials phase, and this is where the researchers submit a new drug application to the FDA. And the FDA is who approves all new drugs and treatments that are used in our population. Researchers will show the FDA the data to support the new drug's safety and greater effectiveness over standard treatment. And then the FDA reviews the data and decides whether or not to approve the drug. And once that drug has been approved by the FDA, then doctors can choose to prescribe the drug.
Quick question. Oh, sorry, Steph.
Go ahead.
Quick question. Is there a certain phase that is considered safer from a participant perspective than others? Like, for example, is phase 1 the most experimental and phase 4 the safest, or does it not quite follow that logic?
Well, no, it does, because safety data is being collected at all phases. Like, let me just say, patient safety is the number one priority. always in clinical trials. Our absolute complete focus is on protecting patients and keeping them safe while they're on an investigational treatment. And so as the trial phases go on, more and more data is collected about safety. So you're kind of on the right track. I mean, we should have more data in a phase 3 trial and a phase 4 than in a phase 1. We should have a much broader safety profile. And some drugs actually go on to a phase 4 clinical trial. And these trials gather even more information after FDA approval, after the drug is on the market, and they continue to look at safety and effectiveness in a much larger population. As well as establish effectiveness in subgroups, such as the elderly or young adults. So there's continually the FDA is collecting additional information. And even after a drug is FDA approved and physicians are prescribing it, patients are taking it, the FDA continues to collect side effect data. And if they find that there's more side effects that are coming about than originally was gathered in all of the phases of clinical trials, they'll put out additional information to prescribers to help keep patients safe. So there are always risks when someone is participating in a clinical trial, and we make an effort to make those risks known to the patient. New drugs, devices, and even procedures may have side effects and risks that are unknown to the doctors. And there is a very rigorous monitoring of patients while they're on a clinical trial to try to prevent any, harm or significant side effects. But there can always be side effects that are unknown at the time the trial starts and are discovered during the study. It's also a risk that these new drugs or new devices, they might not be effective or they're less effective than current approaches. But if we don't do the clinical trial, we won't know. And so it's important for people to know the risks, and we always try to be upfront about that. And even if the new drug or the new device has benefits for some, it may not work for a particular patient. And so that's a risk. There are benefits to being on a clinical trial for patients. Typically, care that's provided is by physicians who are leaders in their field. Patients have access to new drugs and devices and treatments before they're widely available. There's very close monitoring of a patient's health and side effects. This is just a core tenet whenever you're doing a clinical trial, to collect side effects from patients and have research coordinators and research nurses check in on the patient to make sure they're doing okay and not having side effects or catching them early. Patients can take a more active role in their care and their treatment. If the approach that's being studied is proved to be beneficial, those patients may be among the first to benefit. And it's an opportunity to contribute to society and be part of the solution that's finding treatments and cures for conditions.
I will say that last reason you gave is something that I hear from our constituents all the time, which is, even if this isn't going to help me, I want to be part of it. That they do want to feel they are participating in a potential solution, even if it's not the solution that helps them.
That's wonderful. And a little bit later on, I'm going to talk about how patients can get involved and contribute, even if it's not a drug they're testing. Again, patient safety is core to clinical trials. And there are many things in place to protect participants. Our government has the FDA and OHARP, which is the Office of Human Research Protections, that has many different regulations and laws in place to make sure that patients are at the center of our care for protecting them. And everyone on the research team is held accountable for those items, and we're audited and monitored by outside agency to make sure patients are protected. We have even at our own institution, we have an institutional review board. And before a clinical trial can start, before a research study can begin, the researcher has to come to the institutional review board and present the clinical trial or research study and talk about their plan that they plan on doing with patients and how patients will be protected. And the IRB looks at the institutional review board, looks at all of those aspects, scientific merit, patient safety, and they will not approve a study if they don't think it has merit and is safe to do with our population. And then the researcher has to go back and give regular reports to that institutional review board to make sure things are on track. So there's lots of regulations. There's also a process called informed consent that every patient who considers taking part in a research study or a clinical trial goes through an informed consent process. And it's extensive. It's the informed consent process. The first part of it is just explaining to a patient what the study is about. And this is typically a conversation between a patient and their physician. Oftentimes will involve a research nurse or a study coordinator. There's a packet of information, an informed consent document, typically is around 30 pages long or so. I know it's quite extensive. And talks about why the study's being done, what the patient can expect, how long are they going to be in the study, what are the different tests they're going to be having while they're on the study, what are the risks that are part of being on the study, what are the potential benefits, what are their avenues if they're having problems while they're on the study. It's extensive, and it's not just a packet of documents and something that they sign. We typically sit down with patients for about an hour and do this informed consent process and really talk to them about why the study is being done and why they're being asked to consider participation. We want them to have all the information and be able to ask questions and really get any of their concerns answered before they decide to take part in a research study. And like I always tell patients, it is completely optional. Even if your physician asks you to be part of a clinical trial or research study, it is totally up to you as a patient whether you do that. You should never feel obligated or pressured, or, I don't want to disappoint my physician or the research nurse. No. This is all about patients and them, wanting to participate and being engaged and asking questions and making sure they have all the information, to be able to make a good decision. And here's the thing, even as a patient, if you consent to participate in the study, at any time, for any reason, you can always decide, I no longer want to participate in this study. I'd like to withdraw my consent. Now, of course, if you're actively taking a drug, we would want the patient to partner with us to taper them off the drug if they needed tapering. But patients should always know they're in the driver's seat. They have control, and it's ultimately their decision whether they want to participate or not. Um, One of the myths about clinical trials is that, oh gosh, I'm going to get a placebo or I'm going to be a guinea pig. And I want to address that because um, in treatment trials, placebos are very rarely used. And a placebo is just a dummy pill, you're not getting any treatment. And when we're looking at new treatments for diseases, the only time that a placebo is used is typically when there is no alternative treatment. So that's when it is ethical to use a placebo when right now there's no approved treatment. But we would not take someone off a medication that's working and put them on a placebo. And I think there are very few institutional review boards who would approve a study like that. So let me kind of allay people's fears that the placebos are not typically used unless there's no standard treatment. And then it is ethical to do that. There's also in our kind of phase 3 trials, the gold standard is to do randomized clinical trials. And randomized means that patients are assigned to one group or another. And in that randomization, oftentimes the physician has no control over which group you get randomized to. You may get randomized to the control group, which is whatever the standard treatment is, or you could get randomized to the investigational study group. And your physician does not have control over that. As a patient, you must be comfortable with this randomization to participate. If you are not comfortable with being randomized to either group, you should not participate in the clinical trial. And like I said, you're typically getting randomized to the best treatment that's currently available, the standard treatment, or you're getting randomized to an investigational new drug that's being studied. Again, rarely is there a placebo used unless there's no current treatment. And then you could get randomized to a placebo. And what I like to tell patients is that, because I have done clinical trials where there was no approved treatments. And so they could either get randomized to the study drug or observation with no study drug. And I said, you have a 50-50 chance of getting that study drug. And the truth is, the reason the clinical trial is being done is because we don't know if it works. And because some people they hear about something and they get their heart set on being on a study drug, and they'll say, well, gosh, if I get randomized to the control arm and I don't get the study drug, then I'll just quit and get out. And it's not the right mindset going in because, we need that. We need the control group to compare. And I will say in clinical trials, if the study drug is working really well and the group in the investigational arm are doing much, much better, I have seen it where they'll, put a trial on pause and bring all patients over to the study drug if it's working. It's kind of unusual, but it has happened, and I have seen that.
So do the patients in the control group know that they are the control group? Is that revealed at the start of the trial or no?
So not always. It depends on if it's a double-blind trial or if it's an open label study. And so it just depends on the design of the clinical trial, whether patients know what they're getting. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Great question. And there's something called a double-blind clinical trial, and that means the patient doesn't know and the doctor doesn't know what patients are on. It's a
Well, that was
secret.
actually my next question is,
Oh,
does the doctor always know? And the follow-up question, which you might not have an answer to, is there any research on whether in a blind study outcomes are influenced by the doctor having knowledge, even if the patient doesn't?
yeah. I mean, the gold standard of clinical trial design is that randomized double-blind control trial. That is the gold standard where there's no bias because, nobody knows. Nobody knows. The physician doesn't know. The patient doesn't know. The only people that know are the people who are sponsoring the clinical trial, and everyone is blinded.
Okay.
And that is the gold standard. When you talk about the gold standard of clinical trial design, those double-blind randomized clinical trials are the best of the best. So you did ask about, what happens during a clinical trial for a patient. And patients who are on clinical trials, they're going to work with a research team. And that research team, of course, includes the doctor. They're in charge of the clinical trial. But there's typically nurses and research coordinators. There can be social workers and dietitians and other healthcare professionals like, lab techs. And they are all there to provide care to the patient, monitor the patient's health while they're on the study drug or after a device has been used, and guide that patient along everything that needs to be done during the clinical trial. Because in a number of clinical trials, participation can last anywhere from 6 months minimum to 12 months to we are still following patients that I enrolled in the cancer center, going back 15 and 20 years ago, and we're still following them for long-term survival. So patients can be on a study for a long time. Patients need to be aware that when they're on a trial, they're going to have more tests and they may have more doctor visits than if they were in the study. And this is all about patient safety and monitoring. And patients will know about this because in the informed consent document, there will be a schedule of events and tests. So patients kind of know what's going to be happening to them over the course of the trial. And of course, they have members of the research team who are going to be staying in contact with them and coordinating all their visits and staying in touch with them even after treatment ends. You heard me talk about that we still have patients that were treated on a clinical trial 15, 20 years ago that their treatment has been completed for over a decade, but they're still being followed on an annual basis after the treatment and the trial ended.
With that kind of follow-up, is there an end date for it, or you'll collect the research as long as you can until you can't anymore?
Yeah, no, I mean, when a study is started and initiated, approved by the Institutional Review Board, there is, there's an end date, and sometimes it's 10 years. 20 years, sometimes it's a year in shorter studies, but that's known in advance and patients will know in advance. Part of that informed consent discussion and in that informed consent document, the question about how long will I be in this study, that question is answered for a patient. So patients know before they even decide to participate what the expectation is. And if it says you are going to be followed for the rest of your life, it'll say that in the informed consent document and be part of the discussion we have with patients. And it doesn't always mean that a patient has to come in and see us. On some of these long-term follow-up patients, it's, a quick phone call with the research nurse, just checking in to see how they're doing and to find out, especially with oncology trials, they're looking at recurrence to see if they've had a recurrence of their disease. It all depends. Every clinical trial is different, but in advance how long it's expected to last. Really important that a patient, once they decide to participate in the clinical trial, that they follow the instructions. Every clinical trial has an extensive protocol that the physician and the research team has to follow so that all patients are treated the same, and we collect the data and monitor them. A lot of what we do is coordinating patient care to make sure patients come in timely for their exams, their evaluations, any labs that are required or imaging studies. If it's an oral drug, they'll have a patient diary that they complete to make sure they're taking the medicines as prescribed in the clinical trial. And oftentimes there will be questionnaires, like quality of life questionnaires that patients complete. So this is about making an informed treatment decision. And oftentimes treatments can be in the form of a clinical trial. But I like to have patients think about what are the goals of your treatment and talk to your doctor about what your goals are. Is your condition curable? Not every condition is. Can progression be slowed? What are options for their treatment? Their options can be, there can be a variety of options, including clinical trials. So the most important part of this is what a patient is what their goals are, and being an active part in that discussion and treatment decision process to decide what they want to do. I encourage people to ask questions, and if they feel like they need a second opinion, to get those. It's challenging. We were talking a little bit earlier about just the challenges with the physicians and healthcare providers. There are not enough of them, so it's not always reasonable to be able to find a second opinion for treatment. But don't feel guilty about that. If you have access to a tertiary center or to a academic center in a big city that you want to go to, get a second opinion. I always encourage people to bring a family member or friend or someone who can advocate for them to take notes. And, we speak such a foreign language from patients, I think, in our medical speak. And it's always nice to have a friend or loved one there with you to help write things down, or to encourage you to ask questions. I know even myself, when I go to meet with my physician, I'll actually write things down on a little notepad, because I always get in there and somehow get off track and forget to ask my questions. So bring someone with you who can help answer questions or ask questions with you, so you make sure you get your answers before you leave.
Yeah. Everything you just said, I think, applies to outside of clinical trials as well. Just going to the doctor, going to get a diagnosis, going for your, annual or semi-annual checkup with your movement disorder specialist. Come prepared with questions. Bring a family member to help you remember things and to take notes, and get a second opinion if you've got questions about the advice that you were given.
It's true. Yeah. You don't have to be in a clinical trial for these recommendations to be used. Um, so if your physician does talk to you about being in a clinical trial, ask about the different drugs that are being studied, and or just ask your physician, are there clinical trials that might be right for me? And of course, if they're offering a clinical trial, talk to them about the benefits and the risks. You might even ask if there are no clinical trials at your physician's practice. You can ask them where other trials might be located. But the more information you have, the better decision you can make about your care. And always ask about the side effects of treatment options. And this is whether it's an approved drug that you're taking, or an experimental one, and how those side effects might be managed, and especially when patients are on an investigational drug. I always encourage them, if you start to have side effects, please call me. Please call your research coordinator, call your research nurse, tell us about it. Don't wait until you're desperate and, feel like, oh gosh, I need to go to urgent care or to the emergency department. Call us and talk to us about those, because we might be able to get you in with the doctor, talk to the doctor about what you can do to mitigate that side effect and treat it before it gets worse. I think it's just human nature. Patients don't want to, bother their doctor, but when you're in a research study or a clinical trial, there's a whole team of people there to support you, and we're your advocates and an extension that can help get messages and information to the doctor. And I always encourage people, just call. Don't worry about, you're not bothering us. Please just call, and call early if you're having any side effects. So talk with your doctor. Researchers continue to learn more about how to treat diseases, and we're always finding new treatments, new drugs to control diseases and improve quality of life. Ask about your options for standard treatment versus clinical trials. Ask as many questions as you need to. And even if you leave the office and you think you've had all your questions answered about the clinical trial, if something pops up, there's always a research coordinator or a research nurse that's going to be available. And you should get that person's number and, get your questions to that research coordinator, research nurse, so they can go back to the physician and make sure that all your questions are answered. Here's something too. So costs when you're on a clinical trial, because oftentimes people think, oh, I'm on a clinical trial, everything is free. And that is not the case. That is not always the case. There are absolutely some costs that may be covered by the sponsor of the clinical trial. And almost always the investigational drug is provided by the sponsor of the clinical trial without any charges. But sometimes there are charges that are considered standard of care while you're taking an investigational drug. And so they'll just say, oh, well, it's standard of care that you are seen by your physician once every 3 months or once every 6 months. And so the study is not going to pay for that. That needs to be covered by you, because it's just standard of care for your condition. There are some health insurance companies who don't cover costs when you're in a clinical trial. And it's just important that you know about that ahead of time. So always discuss coverage with your insurance company and the clinical research team, just so you know in advance what to expect when it comes to costs. But just to recap, So clinical trials, research studies, they can be important for everyone. They can include people that have not been diagnosed with a disease, those with a new diagnosis, those with chronic disease, advanced disease. They're appropriate for all different age of people, gender, race, everything. So everyone should be looking at participating in a clinical trial. And I tell my parents when they have, a diagnosis that they're looking at, and maybe it's new or maybe it's something that's progressing. I always encourage them, because they're in their 70s and 80s, ask about a clinical trial. Are there any clinical trials that are being looked at for your condition? Because you're going to get extra care when you're in a clinical trial. You're going to have more monitoring. So these are recommendations I make to my own family, and actually not just my parents, but my children who have conditions. I look for clinical trials because I know they're going to get a higher level of care and more monitoring. For the safety in clinical trials, in every informed consent discussion, informed consent document, the doctor and the study team is going to talk about the goals of the study, potential benefits and risks, what's expected of the patient, any monitoring labs or imaging or exams that the patient will need. And this is all about safety. This is all about keeping the patient safe while they're on an investigational medication. And patients, of course, closely monitored while they're on a clinical trial, lots of extra attention. And this is all about patient safety as well. When a patient is on an investigational agent, it's our number one, it is our mission to keep patients safe while they're volunteers on a new drug or a device. And advocate for yourself. If you are the supporting loved one, advocate for your loved one. Make sure you have the information you need to make an informed decision. Being on a clinical trial, there are some benefits. In all clinical trials, you are going to get, at the minimum, whatever the approved best standard treatment is today, and then you may additionally get access to a new drug. Again, you may be one of the first to benefit from that new drug if you are assigned to a group. You get extra attention from the research team, and you have doctors with extensive experience in the conditions that are being studied. To search for clinical trials, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov, and I put in a search for Parkinson's disease. I did that yesterday, and there were 33 studies that came up in California, all different types of studies. So clinicaltrials.gov is a great resource for patients looking for different clinical trials and research studies. And when you click on these, you can get more information. Another resource is researchmatch.org. And this is something you can opt in to this and fill out a survey about what you're interested in and what you're willing to participate in. And Research Match will actually match you to organizations that are doing research studies. And this might be something as simple as a quality of life study, or what else could it be? Things that you don't actually have to travel, but you can participate in the study and make a difference and contribute to research. So I encourage people to look at researchmatch.org and maybe set up a profile. At Eisenhower, we have Epic MyChart. Epic is our medical record that patients use. And for patients who have MyChart, which is accessible both on the computer and on smartphones, there's a link to research studies in MyChart, and patients can set up their research preference profile. And it asks a question of, would you consider participating in research studies? And you can click yes or no. And then you can select the areas of research that you're interested in. This happens to be my personal MyChart, and I just selected I was interested in everything. This way, if there is a researcher that is starting a new study and you've opted in to the topic and said yes, they can send you a message through MyChart to see if you're interested in participating. There's also, if you go to eisenhowerhealth.org, that's our main website, you can look at our current clinical trials. This list is always changing. New trials are always opening, and then other trials are finishing. So if you visit eisenhowerhealth.org, you can look at a list of the clinical trials that we're currently doing. And that's all I have for you. Any questions?
Well, Stephanie, that was some really fantastic information. One thing that jumped out to me, which I had not considered, is that not all of the costs of a research trial might be covered, or that you might have trouble with your insurance, which is already a complex issue for people with any health issue. So I'm really glad that you highlighted that. I do have a question for you. You mentioned somewhere at the beginning that a lot of trials take place at large research institutions, and that Eisenhower has committed to bringing some research trials to Coachella Valley. Why is it hard for smaller institutions to get clinical trials started?
Well, number one is you have to have physicians who are available and have the time, really have the time to do the clinical trial. And that can be challenging. When you have a very busy specialist who has a waiting list, many patients long to get patients in. They don't always have the time to do a clinical trial. And in academic centers, the physicians are different. They're in a different model. They're oftentimes they're teaching. They're teaching new physicians. That's part of their role in a big academic institution. Part of their work is they must do research as part of their employment, and they then also see patients. But in community settings that are not big academic centers, oftentimes our physicians are just very busy just seeing all of the patients that need to be seen. And there's just not as many physicians out in remote areas like we are as there are out in the bigger cities out on the coast. So that's one of the challenges.
Yeah, I know that's an issue for a lot of our constituents is the wait time to get in to see a doctor. So if there's a long wait time, that means there's a long waiting list.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Is there anything that we as the Parkinson's community can do to encourage research trials in our area?
Well, I think, just having the discussion and having patients ask their physician about research and clinical trials, to start planting that seed, and it may encourage physicians to say, oh, you know what? Let me look into that. Let me start talking to some of the organizers of these clinical trials to see if it's something we could do here. But I think patients expressing interest is a first step to getting some clinical trials here locally. And then I encourage your patients, look at that researchmatch.org and look at setting up a profile to participate in some research studies. They're probably not going to be drug studies, but they can make a difference. The patients can make a difference in understanding more about Parkinson's. And so I encourage them to register for that.
Well, that actually segues nicely into my next question, which is, can you talk a little bit about why trials that are focused on understanding disease progression or the causes are as important as trials studying potential cures?
Well, sure, because, I look at cancer for one, and, cancer has been probably the most studied disease and for the longest had the most investment. And we are still looking at cures. There is oftentimes for advanced cancer, there's still no cure, even 50, 60, 70 years after the beginning of studies and clinical trials. We've made huge progress. And actually in every condition, there's been huge progress. But we still need to look at studying the condition. We're always going to learn more. The technology that is becoming available, genetics, if any of your patients, participate in any of the, Ancestry DNA or 23andMe that look at genetics. Actually, both of those groups have research studies that look at genetics of patients, so they can consider that. So it's equally as important to learn more about a disease and condition than just what is this drug working to treat the disease. Of course, that's important, but there's all types of interest because we're looking at quality of life and what can we do until we find the magical drug or device that's going to cure that condition.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, so much for joining us. And I realized I was just talking with my mic off. So I just want to mention for our audience that there is a genetics study taking place via the Parkinson's Foundation. It is called PD Generation. And you can learn more about that one on their website. But that aligns with what you were just saying, Stephanie, about the importance of genetic studies as well. So, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We learned so much, and we will be sure to share this widely because there's a lot to know about clinical trials, and I certainly expanded my own knowledge tonight.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Eileen.
Stephanie.